It is a very beautiful day in Auckland. Well, it was briefly very rainy, but I think it is much more beautiful now. We're just going to wait 2 more minutes, wait for people to join. Um, I'm coming to you live from my balcony. It is very lovely. The stream could well be called Watch Daniel Peacefully Drink Tea on his balcony while he watches all his flatmates inside the flat tip-tapping away on their own laptops. Cool. Just going to wait 1 more minute and then we will get started. Pay no attention to the swinging cloth, which is the washing I did this morning, forgetting that we would be doing this. Excellent. So I think we might as well get started. Kia ora everyone, my name is Daniel. I am coming to you live from the balcony of my flat. We are maintaining self-isolation, but giving each other a wee bit of space. Today we're going to be talking about internal point construction. So looking at how you can take the beautiful ideas you have in a case and making them into effective points in order to make sure that the judge understands the points correctly and you're able to leverage them for the maximum return within the debate. But before that, I'm going to do two things. Firstly, I'm going to quickly run through all of the very cool things you can do debating-wise this week and in the coming weeks while you're all in physical isolation with us. And then secondly, I'll be giving you a recap just of the two previous sessions that have happened, what we covered there, and how some of those ideas might be useful to this in application to the topic we're talking about tonight. So in terms of the events that are coming up from the amazing Auckland DebSoc, and in fact the New Zealand-wide DebSoc, the first thing I would note is that my beautiful flatmate Joe, who is sitting literal feet away from me, working on his computer, has set up a New Zealand-wide Discord channel to discuss things related to debating or not related to debating, but just a way to keep the community together and keep people engaged. So that will be going ahead as well, so just look at that. I think it's on the New Zealand University Debating Society's broader New Zealand Debating Facebook page. If you're having trouble finding that, just flick me a message. Next week, we have the return of Auckland Club Nights. So these will be run digitally and will be very exciting. We'll be keeping you up to the loop with that. But there is also, as well, a New Zealand-wide club night happening tonight that if you go to the New Zealand University debating page as well, you can also find that happening. And that's going to be moving to Mondays in the future. So you can attend both those and the Auckland DebSoc Clubs Nights. There is a Women's Development Day coming up on the 5th of April, organised by the wonderful Aisha, so go to the Auckland page, have a look at that. Equally, we have the Auckland Novice Tournament that's going to be rescheduled for April, that'll also be run digitally, and the first major online tournament in New Zealand is Cinnamon Scroll, which is taking the place of Joint Scroll over Easter weekend. Myself, my flatmate Grace, John BP and Oscar Batal-Wallace, two very experienced CAs and DCAs, will be the edge core of that tournament, and I can guarantee it will be an excellent time, both to adjust to online debating in general, but also to hone your debating skills for when things really get back into the swing of things. So what we're going to do now is just recap what we covered in the previous two sessions. So our first session, we covered prep time, and particularly the things you should be thinking about when you're setting up an overall case. And the two things that I highlighted as being particularly important is figuring out what your comparative is. What are the two things that are being compared in this debate? What does the world look like on either side? What are the specifics of the model that both teams are engaging with? And then the second thing is the framework, which is essentially telling the judge how they should be telling the debate. If I'm able to prove X and X, I should win the debate because XYZ. So running through a framework of how the debate should be judged allows you to fit your points way more effectively into actually winning the debate. The second session then looked at speaker roles, going through the 3v3 style and saying, okay, first, second, third, leaders reply, what should each of these roles be doing? And we drew a distinction between rules that govern these particular speaker position and then their roles. Because some speaker positions have very particular rules that you're not allowed to break. So for example, if you're a third speaker, you're not allowed to bring new substantive material. You're confined to the domains essentially of the debate. And if you're a leader's reply, you're not even allowed to bring new responses. You're essentially constrained to what has already been said. So that's once again an even tighter restriction. Roles, on the other hand, are things that can be deviated from, but that you should overall think about. So for example, if you are the first speaker, it is your role to set up the debate, both the comparative and the framework, thinking through those things, and then deliver the case. The first neg and the second AF, we talked about having a slightly different role from the first AF and second neg in that they're first response positions. So not only do they need to do the normal things of a first speaker or a second speaker, they also need to they're also the first people who have the opportunity to respond to the ideas that are coming out in the debate. They deliver those frontline deliveries, and it's good to be very thorough in that position. Seconds overall shape the debate. They clarify any of the clashes with the comparative or the framework or those foundations. They break the debate into issues, start doing some of that stuff that the third speakers do, and then they extend the argument. So they bring new substantive material to try and broaden the debate. The third, while they have no new substantive points, does bring new responses. So they have to stay within the domain of the debate, and then the reply is only stuff already in the debate. They summarize, explain to the judge, particularly through the lens of that framework that you've set up throughout the case, how should they judge the debate. This is both the points that have been proved, so you say, this is what we were able to prove to you, these are why the responses weren't good enough, but also why those points matter, always bringing back to the idea of a framework or win conditions, or how the judge should judge that debate. What we're looking at particularly now is the internal point. So once you've come up with a beautiful case, and you want to explain that during your speech, how do you maximize the effectiveness of the points? And one thing I would clarify here is you are going to be getting a very Daniel approach to setting up particular points. Different debaters will split them up slightly differently. They'll find that their brain works in slightly different ways. So what I'm giving you is a rough guideline of essentially the ingredients of a point, and the way I like to combine those ingredients, but you don't have to be bound by that setup. The second thing that I'll note before we get into the different types of points is how you set up a point, in my opinion, does not actually depend on your speaker position. It depends on the type of point you are making. And what I'm going to do before diving into each of how you construct each of the points is explain the 5 types of points that I think exist within debating and the essential ingredients of each of those. And a second speaker and a third speaker might use exactly the same structure when they're trying to do the same thing, but each new element of basically role they want to assign that point means you have to then adjust the way that you set it up. So you always ask yourself, what do you want to achieve with this point? And then that will then determine how you engage with it. So the 5 types of points that I think exist are substantive points, rebuttal points. These are the 2 most common. If you will have done schools, these will be the ones that I've told you about. Then issues or clashes, which often you will hear about when people are later within the debate. And then I think there are 2 more types of points that I think are particularly relevant to your second speakers, but are relevant to any speakers. One is a foundation, and essentially you use that point to shape the foundations of the debate. So where there's a miscommunication about what the debate's about, what the comparative, what the frameworks are, you can have a point at the beginning just being like, to the judge, to be very clear, these are the foundations that the debate is happening on. And then there are extension points, which operate slightly different to substantive material, particularly because they tie into often what has already been said in the debate and try and add a new lens or a new angle. So it's not just coming up with a point out of nowhere, it's trying to make your existing material more impactful and more effective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of those points and explain how I think they should be set up for maximum effectiveness. So if we turn to probably the most basic common type of point, especially if you're a first or second speaker, that's substantive points. So when I set up a substantive point, I tend to think 3 things are important. I think CMI. So that's C for context, M for mechanism, and I for impact. When you are setting up the point, what I often do is like, okay, so here's my point headline, here's what I want to achieve. What are the first things that people who are listening to that point need to know in order for it to make sense. So that is the context of the point, and it's where you give people the assumptions that are necessary for all of the point to function. So for example, if you're making a point in a debate about Southeast Asia, and the point you want to make is heavily dependent on how China is going to act, the main bit of context you're delivering is, this is how China makes decisions, this is how China is going to act. So that is an example of a context. You tend to put at the beginning. It's the things that the judge needs to know about the world in order for your mechanism to make sense. Then comes your mechanism, and your mechanism is essentially where you take that context as well as some other fine-tuning that you do within the mechanism point and explain, how do you achieve the goal that you want. If you have this context and you introduce this type of behavior or this type of change, normally it's a change because you want to change something within the debate or compare something within the debate, this is how it then flows onto that. So it's a very logical progression, and some styles put a lot of, some like national styles, put a lot of weight on making sure that this is very like logically linked together, all put together. There's some very mechanistic styles, and so if you do lots of international debating, it's good to really amp up the thoroughness in which you go through that mechanism. And essentially what you do there is you tease out how each of the different alternative worlds are going to act. And very good debaters, when they're doing a mechanism, they don't just say, we're going to change this thing, we think this X thing is going to happen. They make sure that firstly they cover both comparatives, so they go like, this is what happens in their world, this is what happens in our world, this is why we think ours is better. But they also go layers deep. They explain why even if this thing that the opposition wants to claim is true, here's how our point still is able to win. Even if they prove two of the things that they're relying on, here's how our point is still able to win. So they layer on that analysis, and essentially what that does is it means that your mechanism is less able to be rebutted by them trying to break down one of those links. So very good debaters, you'll note, are layering their arguments like they're making a cake, and they tend to be very dense, very good, very thorough mechanisms. The last step, the I within this CMI framework that I've set up, is something that I think is often underrated by debaters, and it's not just because they don't think it's an important thing to do, but often it's quite difficult to do. So one of our later sessions is going to be dedicated entirely to explaining how to impact and weight your points. But what you need to do at the end of every point is two things. Firstly, try and explain how big the impact that you're trying to prove is. So say, for example, we have a debate about the death penalty, and you want to make an argument specifically about the number of people who are falsely accused and falsely convicted. If you do not have an impact session, it's quite easy for the opposition to be like, well, the affirming team is talking about an incredibly small number of people who shouldn't really matter to you within the debate. So if you have the perspective that it's going to be rebutted in that way, they're going to try and minimize the importance, what you do in the impact session is explain why it is important. It is important on a principled level that we care about these people, even if they're a small number. This is not a small number of people, because the police and justice system operates in racist ways, so often it has large numbers of people who are swept up because we don't particularly care about the truth when it comes to people that are being oppressed. There's lots of ways in where you can build up that impact and make sure it stands within the debate, and you need to be consciously doing this because other teams are going to be attempting to minimize it. So the first thing you do in the impact, make sure you quantify how big that impact is. The second part of impact is explaining the impact on the debate. And that's saying within the framework that you will have set up earlier within your case or earlier within your speech, if you're a second speaker wanting to clarify things, you link it back to the idea. If we are able to prove that this number of people is falsely accused and are falsely convicted, we win this debate because X. You need to have that tie-in not just to how big something is within the debate, big something is in like the world you've constructed, but also how big it is within the debate. Because minimizing points can happen both through minimizing the like quantity of point, but also minimizing the quality of the point, how important we should weigh it within the debate. So you need to be adding that material. Are there any questions? And you can just dump it in